Good morning, everybody. That's how Radio on 702 greets us in the morning. Good morning, everybody. Uncle Don, NACCW leadership and friends of the sector, it's just one hell of a lot of fun to be here. Thank you so much to Herman, Andy, Jack, and other international guests that are supporting this important conference. Most importantly, thank you to the child and youth care workers, to whom we just celebrate for the work you are doing at the cutting edge of the lives of the children that we all deemed to be the VIPs of our nation. So thank you very, very much. I was asked to talk a little bit about, let me just see how I'm going to, okay, there we go. About expanding community-based child and youth care services in South Africa. Colleagues, for an esteemed guest and audience like this, I don't need to convince you. And we've heard since about two days ago that the apex problems of South Africa and challenges remains poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Now, I don't always agree with the economists of our country or international, but I do agree when they say that income per child in any household is the best proxy measure of inequality. And inequality is the best proxy measure of the opportunities that children will have in their lifetime to access quality schools, education, health, and other services. But it's also an important indicator of the cushion that they will have if something goes wrong. Now, if this is the case, if that's the case, then I assert to you, and I'm sure others will join me in asserting that child poverty in South Africa is indeed South Africa's biggest development challenge. If I would have to put 10 children in this first row this morning, 6 out of those 10 children are living in ultra poverty, just under the poverty breadline in South Africa. 63% of our children live in poor households. 5.5 million of them live in households where no adult is employed. We know as child and youth care workers that poverty is highly associated with the numbers of children that's in our child care and protection system. We also know that child poverty is highly associated with your child care arrangements. Whether you're in a family with only a mom, both parents, with grandma, or in other alternative care. So poverty is an extremely important consideration in our sector. We also know from the work that we do and from the personal testimonies that we've had over the past 2 days that children have no control on the conditions in which they have been born or the structural barriers that they face in their everyday lives that keep them marginalized, keep them excluded from mainstream economic participation and well-being. We also know, because of this, that children remain the key hauliers or carriers of poverty to the next generation and the next generation. And we around this conference, all of you, have a role to play, and we are on the cutting edge of breaking that cycle of poverty. Now, the NDP 2030 is generally lauded or seen as government's map, calling on all of us to change this vision, to fix this position. And one of government's apex objectives, therefore, is to have this economy grow. Now, I assert to you that we know from international economics that growing economies don't necessarily translate in the eradication of poverty. Neither does it necessarily relate to the improvement of the conditions in which our children live. Government in South Africa have had huge success in terms of showing statistics that demonstrate that child poverty has been reduced. And one of the biggest success stories is the success of our cash transfer program. Everybody knows about that, right? The child support grant. Even our international guests will know about that. Hugely reigned as a successful development story around the region and internationally. But we also know that cash alone is not enough. This is our South African child protection context. Child protection, including social security, is part of our social protection floor. So that first block constitutes government's response to child poverty, including a range of protective factors and interventions: free health care for mothers and children, education, the child support grant, extremely doing well in terms of birth registration, a great nutritional school program and others, social housing, EPWP, etc. That's the social protection floor. Just underneath that comes our child care and protection policy, which gives expression to our Children's Act. And our Children's Act directs what we do in the child protection system. Our child protection system historically has paid attention to both, or emphasis to both, prevention services as well as statutory services. My discussions henceforth will deal with the importance of prevention and early intervention services as a strategy towards poverty eradication in our sector. You all know about Isibindi. We've heard about Isibindi. Isibindi is government's flagship program that was initiated with NACCW a couple of years ago. And of course, both Sidi and Connie has spoken about that, so I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to demonstrate is that the Children's Act emphasizes the fact that we must change the pyramid in terms of where our emphasis for interventions must lay. Earlier, our emphasis was on statutory care. The pyramid that you see now is turned around towards an investment in prevention and early intervention services for children. Colleagues, economists was not always interested in prevention and early intervention services. You'd recall the past 2 decades, I assume, that it was with the Heckman series of studies focusing on early childhood development, that this series shifted the thinking of economists around ECD, making the point that, or demonstrating that, the investment in ECD will lead to long-term positive outcomes for both children and the economy. Now, if we have this huge investment, like South Africa has followed on in ECD, we just invested about 850 million for this financial year on ECD. If we have to sustain that development, I say to you that we need to follow that up with what we now call the second tier early prevention and early intervention services. That is just right there, and I don't have a pointer. If you look up at the Heckman graph, you'll see the first investment is in preschool. What we're asserting is that if we want to sustain and maintain the investments that we are making in ECD, we must invest further in the school years. The ages between 7 to 18 becomes critically important, and that is where child and youth care workers find themselves. The challenge now is for the sector to demonstrate that investment, to demonstrate the long-term financial, both human and financial gains that the sector and the country can make by investing in those important development stage of children. Our approach, therefore, must be insightful, systematic, and based on evidence. We also know, if we look at the continuum of childhood, that there's an increase in children's vulnerability as the age increases. In other words, it's not so that younger children are necessarily more vulnerable than older adolescents. Based on the lessons that we gained from Isibindi program, remember the investment in Isibindi was a 5-year program, MOU with government. We came to the point last year where we needed to stand back and focus and ask the very important question, and so what? What's the benefits gained? Are we gaining the outcomes that we set, the objectives that we set for Isibindi right in the beginning of the program? So we invested in 3 processes. 1, a midterm evaluation of the program. We commissioned a sustainability project or research study on Isibindi and how the future might look like. And we also gained lots of insights from our internal and external child protection systems review. Based on this analysis of this outcome data and benefiting enormously from the feedback gained from your own testimonies as child and youth care workers, we looked towards the future. What could a future scenario look like? We know that Isibindi is making a huge difference. I was just at awe, was it on Monday, Zeni, I think, to hear the testimonies of young people that went through the Isibindi program. From those testimonies, we could come to one conclusion. That indeed is radical economic transformation. When children and young people were talking about when they were 15 years old, at the brink of suicide, drugs, and alcohol, a child care worker stepped into their lives. I was saying to somebody, I was really captured by a statement a child made when the young woman said, "The child care worker opened my cupboard, and my cupboard was full of emptiness." And that same young woman today is a second-year student at a tertiary education institution. She's studying electrical engineering. Another one is studying social work, and so on. And so that's the impact. These live bodies, these people whose lives has now been transformed. That is investment in human capital. Because I can assure you, their children will be educated. Their children will not go hungry. And they've broken the cycle of poverty. Now, if that is not radical economic transformation, I don't know what it is. What we need to do as a sector is to make that point, to change our language in terms of the value and the worth of the work that we do. What we've learned from the Isibindi, besides the fact that it's working and it's effective, we need to be serious about the interventions and the choices of the activities or interventions that we've made. The combinations of those programs, what I would call the combination and the dosage of what we do is important. We must be thinking about what is going into those programs, because what's going into that is what we're going to get out from there. We've also learned that relationships are extremely important. And so the most important tool that we have for this kind of cutting-edge, transformative work is the child and youth care worker themselves. Because it's that relationship between the child and youth care worker and the child that makes the difference, primarily. And we must value that. Thirdly, we've learned about consistency. We have, when we started, and we'd like to, if we look at the stats and the status report on Isibindi will tell you, we've reached about 1.1 million children over 4 years. That's very good. We've reached 400, almost 400 NGOs as implementing organizations. And we've trained 7,000 child and youth care workers. That's remarkable. What is not so remarkable is not that, it is that not all of that 1.1 children are still there today. So we need to be serious around how do we keep them in the program over a long time so that they can benefit from the interventions. Of course, there are those that exit, but we need, of course, we have factors that influence the attrition rate of child and youth care workers in terms of staying around. But it's important that we take cognizance of those reasons of why children are falling out of the program and why child and youth care workers are leaving the profession. And so just very quickly now, in terms of what did we learn from our analysis and your feedback. We've learned that we need to, going forward, invest in a couple of pillars. Firstly, we need to target better. We need to map in our country where we sit with 63% of poverty. We need to get better at targeting the most vulnerable. Now, if we have 12.6 or almost 12.6 million children on the child support grant, those children have already been measured. They're already means tested. We know they are poor. All of them should get some investment, plus the cash. But it must be cash, plus the care, plus the protection. So the first pillar is, how do we identify the most vulnerable? And how do we target them? How do we reach them? Second pillar that we need to get better with is the intent story. The story of the theory of change. What must change? And how do we know that? What drives the change? And how do we know that we're doing more good than harm? That's the theory of change. What informs our practice? Thirdly, if we know where we want to go, what is the kind of interventions that we need to apply? What is the 5 or 6 core services that every child must have? Fourthly and fifthly, once we know what they should have, what constitutes that essential institutional mechanisms that will support that program? How do they access that program? How does that access point look? How is it supported? How is it maintained? And lastly, what does all this cost? Currently, we know government is doing some investment. We know very little about how much the corporate sector invests in this space. And the corporate sector is a huge benefactor of children's lives and children's well-being. How do we get them to buy into this picture? This is a slide that basically tells the story of how we better map, how we reach, and the number of children that we reach. So if the data on children living in poor households, orphans, children with disabilities, and child-headed households is aggregated provincially, and where a child qualifies for at least one of these categories, then there are about 4.4 million vulnerable children between the age of 5 and 18. So that gives you more or less an idea of the immediate scope. So we've targeted 1.1 children for this 5 years. The next phase should target not less than 4 million children. And what does that say in terms of the expansion of child and youth care work? This slide emphasizes the issue of a theory of change, and we focused on the resilience theory because it provides a conceptual and action-orientated framework that demonstrates and challenges the social and cultural odds stacked against children, rather than focusing only on the child's ability to cope. So we looked at a theory that would be able to augment and support our existing theory of the socio-ecological approach which we use in childcare in our work as government. Essentially, the resilience theory moves children from vulnerability to resilience. And the idea is that there are specific outcomes in terms of how we see a successful resilience story. And those are the 5 characteristics that we're looking at: an end product, a child, a young person that is independent, aspirational, generous, productive, and healthy. So when you've concluded your work as a child and youth care worker, those are the characteristics that you look for in a young person that came through your hands. That's the basket of services. That the baskets of services that I've just alluded to earlier would include a package of psychosocial support, attention to basic needs in terms of access to social security, nutrition, social housing, food security, care and protection, health promotion, and education and support. We've also realized that only having those headings in terms of program design is not enough. It's about unpacking what each of those core services would mean and, in fact, include. We're very certain that not every child needs everything at the same time, that we need to diversify our programs and our interventions. And then the issue of access points. Where does children access these services? Currently, the Children's Act makes provisions for community-based access points in the form of drop-in centers. Now, initially, drop-in centers was a access point for children who suffered or was infected or affected by HIV/AIDS. Now we know that we don't have many of them. The point that we are making here is not that they would be the only points of access. The points that we are making is that community-based services, prevention and early intervention services for children must be regulated. They must be registered. We must know how they're structured, capacitated, and whether they can deliver the basket of services that they should deliver. So there will be a huge investment going forward in making sure that access points in community-based prevention and early intervention services are in fact capacitated. Colleagues, we know, and I've said this before, government cannot afford community-based services on its own. We need to make sure, and we need to invite other partners, work closely with other partners to ensure that these important services are in fact capacitated and that we have the kind of resources that we can expand to the scope of children that in fact, the numbers of children that in fact needs the services. So mapping the current sector, where's the money, who's in this space, who's doing the work, costing what a basic service will cost, and of course developing a financial strategy for community-based prevention and early intervention services. Finally, there's huge opportunities for child and youth care workers going forward. What we must do is to find different ways of working together. Some of the speakers yesterday alluded to the fact that we need to think differently, organize differently. So are we talking about new innovations? Are we talking about social entrepreneurships, perhaps social franchises for youth? What we'd like to see, the same energy that you use to dance and to sing, is to bring that to this kind of context. New energy, new creativities in terms of how do we approach this new landscape of developing and expanding child and youth care work in communities. About 30 years ago, in 1987, Comrade Oliver Tambo said at the international conference in Harare on children's rights, and it sounds so familiar today, and I thought it was appropriate, when he said, we are meeting here because there's something wrong, something happening to the helpless and innocent that should not be allowed to happen. It's in your space to change that. Tambo also warned that our liberation would be untrue to itself if it did not, amongst its first task, attend to the welfare of the millions of children whose lives has been stunted and turned into a terrible misery. It sounds so familiar, even 30 years since. So we motivate you, we encourage you to stay focused and motivated while you do this extremely important work, and we're ready to support this sector in moving forward. Thank you.